Othello is Iago's play. Iago is one of the richest, most interesting characters Shakespeare ever wrote, and consequently, one of the most psychologically complex, deep portrayals of a human being anywhere in human literature. Or he is a one-dimensional plot device. Maybe Iago is much, much less interesting than we think he is. And Othello, who we tend to think of as a bit of a boring, dopey, idiot thug who murders his wife for no reason, is he a man with psychological complexities and depths which we, for whatever reason, deliberately ignore? Why is Othello criticism so skewed towards Iago? Why do we read so much into Iago's motivations, his sexuality, his mental states, and why do we read so little into Othello? These are some of the things Milo and I recently talked about with Oxford academic Emma Smith. If you're at all familiar with Shakespeare studies, at least in the UK, the odds are you've probably come across Emma Smith. She's one of the country's best known and most respected Shakespeare academics. She's also a delightful conversationalist, and we enjoyed speaking to her immensely. This discussion on Othello is taken from a much longer interview in which we also discussed Shakespeare's strangest play, Timon of Athens. Be sure to watch that if you're interested. Please like this video, leave a comment, leave any Othello hot takes down below. If you like what Milo and I are doing here on this channel, please subscribe. You can sign up to our mailing list, and we'd be very grateful if you could support us on Patreon, where you'll receive unique content, extended discussions, reading lists, and various other unique material. Without any further ado, though, here is the discussion.
So the other night I was, I'm back home at the moment in Leeds with my mum visiting, and we were watching the Traitors, and I kept thinking how good Iago would be on the show. Sewing all these webs of discord with his words and playing people against each other. And I thought it was funny, again, on the British mentality, that by far the most popular show in this country at the moment cashes in on the audience's most antisocial instincts.
Yeah.
The perverse delight in watching people manipulate each other, lie to each other, abuse each other's trust, and exercise the most Machiavellian, amoral side of their intelligence, which is the same appeal as Othello in some ways.
In some ways, isn't it? Although just as you were saying that, it's such an interesting comparison, and I hadn't quite thought of it before. What's different about how Shakespeare structures Othello, and I sort of wonder why he does this, is that we, the audience, are never in any doubt. So part of the appeal of the Traitors is, we're all supposed to be, watching at home and saying, oh, that looked a bit dodgy, or, I don't trust him, because we're playing along. We don't have inside information. Whereas the very first scene of Othello is Iago and Rodrigo talking together about how Iago hates them all, and how he's going to, try and mess things up for him.
And it puts you in a pleasant position of power, doesn't it? You have you wield the knowledge, and you have power over the characters, and there's a strange.
You do have power, but I wonder if there's partly a feeling. There's partly a way in which that reduces ultimately the sympathy we can feel with Othello, because we're not encouraged to think, oh, I was taken in by him as well, or he is because in a way Iago seems to us absolutely straightforward and confiding, and tells us what he's doing. So I don't know if that in some way
it's interesting that you feel that way. For me, even in his soliloquies, I think Iago's not being entirely direct with the audience, but maybe this is just my feeling about it. It's
interesting. It depends whether what you want from Iago is a sense of what's going on, whether you're really sort of fascinated, whether one is fascinated by him and wants to understand, following Coleridge and all of that, his motivation for what he does. But if you are just thinking about what is his behavior in the play, what is his role in the play, his role is to disrupt and bring down Othello in some way, and that is very clear right from the start.
Yeah, it's interesting how appealing he is, despite possibly being the most evil and monstrous character Shakespeare ever wrote. I suppose it's a pleasure watching anyone do anything well, and Iago lies very well, which becomes quite meta when you consider that the whole art of theatre could be called the art of lying well.
Yeah,
I mean, Iago is in a sense the author of Othello. He makes up the plot of the play as it goes along,
yeah,
right in front of the audience, that
yeah.
thinking
He can do a
aloud.
bit of improvising when the handkerchief
Exactly.
turns out to
Uh,
be, sort of differently presented
yes.
than he expected. Yeah,
Not
absolutely.
and not
Auden
mi-
calls him, doesn't he, the
mm,
amateur of tragedy in real life.
Yeah, and
So,
not merely about the plot's mechanisms, but also about things like character motivations, plausibility. He almost thinks, what emotion would it be most likely for me to feel right now
yeah.
before eventually feeling it? Concerns which characters within drama very rarely have, but which are the bread and butter of dramatists. Do you think we're experiencing Shakespeare as the dramatist through Iago to an extent?
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, isn't it? We're definitely, I mean, all those parallels that you've listed are absolutely definitely there. I suppose the counter to that might be that in a way, Iago is much less interesting than that, that he is a kind of plot device to bring about the um, to puncture the kind of hubristic pride of Othello, and that it, we have we have invested all this in him for reasons which perhaps speak to our own lack of interest in Othello. I mean
Hmm.
that's an interesting. I mean, if you say something, everybody studies Othello at the moment in the UK.
Mm.
All A level is the A level play at the moment is Othello,
Okay. Mm.
and so I spend quite a lot of time talking with students about it, in really interesting ways. And what we sometimes talk about is uh, here is here is Othello, a black man in a racist white world, and here is a racist called Iago. Why is it so complicated for us to think, why does he do what he does? I mean, why have we overcomplicated that? Now, in some ways, that's an oversimplification of it, but it's rhetorically helpful in a way to think maybe we have invested Iago with this sort of occluded complexity in ways which speak to our collective unwillingness to invest that much in Othello himself.
Mm. I
So that
suppose.
in a way we
Mm.
enact the same thing that's happening. There's a really interesting thing called the which she calls the Othello syndrome by a brilliant American critic called Diana Thompson, and she says that in when companies are putting on Othello, the black actor who is now always plays Othello,
It's the only
rightly.
non-colorblind role, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It tends to be less familiar because of other casting practices with classical drama.
Mm.
The Iago tends to be the white star, and because his part is so complex and sort of interesting, he kind of spends more time with the director, and he has this kind of meta theatrical sense, so he's almost like the
Mm.
director, and this pushes the
Yeah.
Othello character and the actor more. And I was just reading that, and it really sort of struck me as that the emphasis on Othello is a kind of a version of that, or could be seen in that light.
Yeah, and I suppose Othello's virtues or character traits are traits which are profoundly alien to us now. He's a classical hero who's good at war.
Yeah,
We're in a generation that abhors these things
yeah,
now. People who are good
yeah,
at waging war were, heroes in almost every
yeah,
human society before our own. Probably just still the echoes of World War II
yeah.
hanging over us and affecting our ability to appreciate a great classical warrior.
Mhm.
So, to that extent, he's also uninteresting due to that chance of history. I think Desdemona's interest in Othello is his classicism, or his status as a classical hero, especially compared with all the sort of wealthy, curled darlings
Yeah.
of Venice, who are desk job men. If Rodrigo is anything to go by, quite lackluster suitors.
Mm.
And Desdemona craves this danger, this very manly
Mm.
masculinity in Othello. I think
Yes, there's the great line,
yeah,
isn't there, when she said she wishes God had made her such a man, and it's not clear
yeah.
whether the line means that she could marry
Such a
or have
man
such
as
a
a
man or
suitor, or
become
whether
one. Yeah,
become one. Yeah,
yeah.
and
Mm.
her, if we interpret it as her becoming such a man, then her motivations overlap somewhat with Iago's. She's jealous of what Othello is. Um, yeah.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Um, that these are both versions of sort of wanting to be him.
Mm,
Um, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So that they're. I mean, that would be sort of what René Girard would call sort of mimetic envy or something. So Girard is really interesting on these sort of violent bromance kind of
Mm.
um, kind of relationships and how you might see those sort of psychoanalytically, structurally.
One performance sadly lost that would have captured this side of Desdemona very well, and probably the single Shakespeare performance I would go back in time to see, was during the Mexican-American War. Ulysses S. Grant played the role of Desdemona in
How brilliant! How
in,
brilliant!
yeah, for the troops.
It's that is really
Yeah.
interesting that it would be worth going back to see because there's a sort of truism about productions of Othello that either they are Othello's production or
Mm.
they are Iago productions, but they're very, very rarely Desdemona productions.
Yeah, or
Um,
Desdemona and Othello's marriage. That's very rarely the forefront. I mean, the
yeah,
marriage, there's already cracks in the marriage and conflict going on without Iago being there. Iago, I mean, Othello wants to settle down. He's lived this life on the road as a warrior, wants to be integrated into Venetian society. Like Shylock in Merchant of Venice, he's an outsider who's brought into Venetian society, but not brought all the way in, not equal under the law, to do the Venetians' sort of dirty work for them, whether it's money lending practices they're not comfortable with or war. But and Desdemona is wants to get out of Venetian society. They're at cross purposes with each other. Desdemona
yeah,
longs
that's
for
interesting. Does
everything.
Othello want
Yeah.
to settle into Venetian society? I mean, he tells Iago
Mm.
that it's only because he so loves her that he has sort of agreed in a way to
Yeah.
settle down.
I
And the
think they
play,
both regret it. I think they both regret it throughout the play in their marriage. I think, yeah,
interesting.
I think Othello, or at any rate, I think it's the pity. It's for Desdemona's pity that he says is the thing that's new about her. He's explaining all these very Homeric, his life story sounds like Odysseus,
Yeah.
um, tales to her of daring do, and she takes pity on him.
Yes.
So those are the two
Yes.
novel things in both of their lives that they
Yes. And
represent to each
there's a
other.
textual variation, isn't there, between the two versions? She gave me for my pains a world of sighs, which is what we
Ah,
tend to get uh, preferred as being more sort of virginal, perhaps, or more appropriate. She gave me for my pains a world of kisses is the other version.
mm,
Um,
okay.
and it's interesting to think about a more perhaps a more autonomous, a more headstrong, a more comic, actually, a kind of comic heroine who knows what she wants and she wants, something that's more exciting than what she's got. Desdemona, that you're describing, Jack, might be perhaps more likely to say a world of kisses,
Mm.
to have given a world of kisses. It's not she who says it, it's Othello. Mm.
In another fashionable thing in modern portrayals of Desdemona is to um, show her reciprocating Iago's lust to varying degrees, or at least to show her as a more worldly, sexually knowing and flirty character, especially in that scene on the dockyard. What do you think this version of Desdemona does to the play? Do you think this is an improvement showing the character like this.
Well, it's absolutely there in the play. I mean, in some ways, it's a counter to versions of the play which previously suppressed that, with a sense that Desdemona could only be, had to be a sort of absolutely to be proved to be absolutely innocent in every regard in order to be believed and pitied at the end. So I think it is interesting that Shakespeare has given us that scene, which with a more knowing Desdemona, but it's part of the what I experience in the play, and it's interesting that some of these disruptions or inconsistencies in Timon, as we were talking about before, might be exactly the kind of thing that are attributed to joint authorship. But with Othello, that isn't the case. I mean, I think Desdemona is a very unevenly presented character. I think there's a representation of her in Venice, where she is the comic heroine defying her father and choosing her own husband. I think on the quayside she becomes a sort of, she engages with Iago's rather sort of salty kind of sexually knowing language, but then very quickly in Cyprus, she is unable to, and she speaks up, doesn't she, for Cassio and how he should be reinstated. But then she's unable to speak for herself, and then she has that scene with Emilia saying, are there really women who betray their husbands? Now that seems a very different voice from the voice on the quayside. So there's a sort of unevenness about Desdemona, about whether she is a strong, clever, comically sort of shaped heroine like Rosalind, or As You Like
a perfectly murderable virgin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And maybe the end of the play is trying to backpedal a bit on Rosalind and give us something a bit more perfectly murderable, because we're getting towards the murder, and how the play can get as much sympathy for Othello as it can might depend on Desdemona becoming a more passive, tragic heroine, sort of lying down and being murdered.
Mm.
Yeah, it sort of feeds into the Iago as playwright, but Shakespeare as playwright, he needs us to see Desdemona in a certain way at a certain time to motivate our feelings. So Iago does this to Othello to ensure that Desdemona becomes what she needs to be for him to do what he therefore needs to do. Whereas for us, I suppose, and a newer audience who aren't so familiar with Desdemona as a type, maybe the quayside scene would feel more important. Just feel like, this is interesting. Is this what's she up to here? And then never mind. Whereas I think we have this, especially there are many productions that cut that part, cut it down, that try to like I recently watched Orson Welles' film version where Desdemona is, there's two different performances of Desdemona in two different cuts, but in both of them she is sort of a pillar of virtue, and he doesn't risk it essentially with a scene like that, because his version of the play is more elemental. But I think when we come into Othello now, it is already elemental, and we look for it, or we look for it to be contradicted. But it's an interesting point, just that maybe the inconsistency of the character is a device as much as it is a failure in drama.
Yeah, it would be part of you could make it as part of a wider argument, and again, Timon would be the exception that would be interesting to try and take on board. A wider argument that says that women in Shakespeare's tragedies are plot devices. They are there primarily to help display or bring about certain responses in the male tragic characters. That's their role, and they don't have a role beyond that. And I think Desdemona resists that for a while, but her spirit is broken by the play.
in the source material, the main Iago motivation is lust for
Is that he's in love with her? Yeah,
is
yeah.
love for Desdemona. Orson Welles sort of in his reading the motivation for Iago is impotence and jealousy of
Hmm.
Othello's sexual potency. In the Kenneth Branagh version, it's played gay. It's Iago's lust or love for Othello. There's a lot of discourse about Iago's
Yeah.
asexuality as well. Could you speak a bit about what's going on with Iago's sexuality and the tradition,
Well, again, I
political
think
tradition?
this is a slightly a red herring, or it's an
Mm,
interesting red herring that the 20th century has needed in order to corroborate its primary interest in Iago
mm,
rather than in Othello. But I do think that they're an interesting set of readings in that they establish sex as the primary sort of emotion or the primary expression of emotion in this play,
mm,
wherever you might find that, which is a different kind of central emotion maybe than we get in other tragedies. So that would be an interesting way to think about Othello as a play about damaging uh, sexual obsession in different ways. I mean the idea that
mm,
Iago is gay or secretly desires Othello has some textual corroboration, I suppose, in the kind of mock marriage that they
yeah,
swear to each other um, in Act Three when this great bravura scene that everybody talks about, where Iago has persuaded Othello from great confidence in Desdemona to being willing to murder her in her bed. That marriage scene does suggest that Iago, in some ways, has taken the place of Desdemona, but perhaps he never, Desdemona never really took the place of Iago. I mean, this is an absolute
mm,
sort of bros before hoes kind of a play, isn't it? That in the end, your military companions are the people you trust and you believe in, not your new, not your relatively new wife. They're never to be believed. But I do think that idea comes that Iago is gay. I mean, comes from a time before the legalization of male homosexuality in
mm.
the UK. It's a way of saying this is how bad and twisted gay men
Okay,
are. So
right.
it's a deeply reactionary and sort of troubling
Mm,
attribution. That doesn't mean that it's not valid, but it does have a sort of politics to it. It comes from a time when you would say, yeah, this is what being gay makes men into, makes them,
yeah.
yeah,
It's a piece
makes them sick.
Machiavellian, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And in that Act Three dialogue, when Othello commands Iago to find evidence such that no doubt will be permitted, and Iago asks, "Do you actually want to see them in coito, Cassio and Desdemona?" And Othello then responds in sort of jumbled rambling and sort of begins to command Iago to destroy his own mind, and um, is Othello being this man's man, this mercenary in the man's world, so ignorant of sexual matters that he doesn't realize he could simply have sex with Desdemona and thereby determine whether or not she is a virgin, or does he deliberately prevent himself from getting this any conclusive evidence?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Uh,
Do you mean that you imagine? I mean, this is all in some
yeah,
ways a crazy set of questions, isn't it? These are not people who have sex because they don't exist.
of
But
course,
in
yeah.
the play, haven't aren't they having sex at the Sagittary when has to get up to go to the courtroom when the I mean, there's been an
Um,
interesting prurience about this in criticism, which has wanted to suggest that they don't consummate their marriage. And it is certainly true that the play is quite concerned to keep disrupting them whenever they seem to go off
mm,
stage together. Firstly, with the news of the Turkish threat to Cyprus, then with Cassio's manufactured sort of drunken brawl, and so on. And then, the question about what does it mean when Desdemona puts asks Emilia to put the wedding sheets on the bed is she saying we haven't yet consummated our marriage, or is
Okay,
she
right.
saying
Yeah.
these are the sheets that will recall the sense that we are close and married couple? So yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, and Othello says, doesn't he, before he murders her, I'll not shed her blood.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um, what do you make of Brabantio, Desdemona's father, at the end of the play being proven completely right in all
yeah,
of his prejudices against Othello? He
yeah.
says, you can't marry a Moor, it's an abhorrence against nature. Within a few days, his daughter's dead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that we're reminded of him in the last scene, which is
Mm,
which is unnecessary, unless it's to make that point that you're making. So thy match was mortal to him. So not only was Brabantio was not a sort of nasty old bigot, but that he was so wounded and troubled by Desdemona's marriage that he too has died. Um, and it's a good job he's not alive to see it. I mean, that could all be part of a reading which says, I mean, this has been the great sort of late 20th, 21st century question about this play. Is this a play that is racist, or is it a play about racism? That's to say, does it engage with and set at a distance and look at and interrogate prejudices based on race, or does it actually participate in them? And I think if you were arguing the second, that it is itself racist, but the Brabantio would be an exhibit in that. I think that having seemed at the beginning to be the blocking figure who is stopping the comic marriage, so he's a father like Aegeus is in Midsummer Night's Dream. Nobody can imagine the end of Midsummer Night's Dream saying, "Well, Aegeus was right all along. He should have gone into a
mm,
convent." The whole point is that he is wrong, and that he needs to be circumvented, and that's a comic, the blocking figure in the new comedy of Terence and the other Roman playwrights. That's a really common structure, isn't it? So
mm,
Brabantio looks like that figure, but then recasting him at the end, given what has happened, as a terrible prophet,
mm.
it sort of changes the genre of the play and changes the resonance of that in some disturbing ways.
Yeah. What?
But
Never. Yeah. Go on.
well, I suppose it's interesting because while he's right, he's wrong in the mechanism, and there's this sense sometimes felt in Othello that it was his virtue that became his evil, and that he was. I mean, his quote is of one that loved not wisely
Mm, yeah.
but too well. The idea being that only his supreme amount of love could convert into this murderous jealousy, which is a paradox. And it's one mirrored in Timon when he says, unwisely, not ignobly have I given. And there's this notion that maybe Timon is become so wretched. I mean, it's implied, no middle way. He's of the extremes, but becomes so wretched because he has such high standards for humanity, and they're consistently unmet.
Yeah,
And that in all of his statements, there's an equal negative statement. So him saying all of these things that are true of all the caitiffs of mankind, where in fact, if his anti-reality were true, then we'd live in a sort of paradise. And so Othello, he was too honest and too believing. And if he was right, I mean, I suppose we wouldn't justify murdering Desdemona, especially in a modern context. But he says this interesting line, or she'll betray other men, almost
Mm,
like this is a universal defense of men against such
yeah,
women as he believes her to be. And so in that frame, again, in a somewhat maniacal, somewhat madman frame, he is doing what he believes to be a good act, which would probably by Brabantio be agreed to be good if his premises were true, which they're not. But there's a
yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point about. It goes back to what we were talking about Desdemona's character. It's clearly very important to Shakespeare that Desdemona. It's the only defense of Desdemona that she is absolutely pure. And there is some that allows for what is deeply troubling to us now, that if she were not, there might be more justification
mm.
for Othello's conduct. Yeah, I mean, one that loved not wisely but too well. It's a really, really interesting line, isn't it? I was looking at it just recently and wondering whether where he loved not wisely but too well was with Iago, in fact.
Mm,
That it was in believing Iago that this has gone wrong, rather than in Desdemona. It's a possibility. I mean, since Desdemona is so absent from that final speech, it could be read in that way. Yeah, I don't know what we do with that, given, as you say, that doesn't really work for the modern age. I can see you might make a historical argument about that, but it's a deeply distasteful argument to me to go myself with the idea that only sort of supreme love can turn into this murderous jealousy, just because as we're in an epidemic, aren't we, of this kind of violence, intimate partner violence against women. Has reached epidemic proportions, and it seems very, very troubling to suggest that in some way that is about extreme. Yeah, it seems troubling to me. Yeah,
It's the perpetrator's version of what is going on as well. That I am, I just love you so much.
that no one else is
Yeah,
going to have you. Or that's right.
exactly.
See,
Yeah.
these are possessive, and it's a deeply possessive speech, isn't it, about the Indian or Judean who threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe. It's about having had a treasure and throwing it away. So even at the moment of acknowledging what he's done, he's thinking in these possessive terms.
Yeah. Well, when we were talking about Desdemona's sort of status and character changing as she gets closer to the murder, I was just thinking of the film Psycho came into my head, where we start with this woman who's commits some kind of smallish financial crime, has run away with some money, is in this low down on the virtue ladder, but she's not murdered while she's like running with the money. She's not murdered in her clothes. She's murdered in the completely innocent position. You need to get her into the place where she's completely encapsulated in complete helplessness and innocence in the shower before she's murdered. And Othello does sort of similar things.
It's a really, really interesting
Yeah.
comparison, actually. I think it would
Yeah.
be, I think it would be an interesting, it'd be an interesting comparison. It'd be interesting to go with what you were saying about Iago as a dramatist figure, thinking. I mean, the Hitchcock director cameo kind of thing could be really fun to think more about there. I'm glad you made that comparison.
Yeah, great. We're gonna sort of wind slowly to the ends now. I just one other thing I'd like to talk about before we end is I'm really interested in Iago's ultimate downfall being overlooking the capacity of goodness in his wife, overlooking, sorry, her capacity for self-sacrifice. His underestimation of Amelia, he can't take account of her capacity for good. Do you think his silence at the end of the play is simply stupefaction and shock at this capacity of Amelia? Or do you think that this is a bad reading?
Well, it's a really interesting reading. I mean, Amelia is I talked a minute ago about how Desdemona is a sort of bumpy character, and Amelia is a really bumpy character, isn't she? That
Yeah,
she knows she can't imagine that she can't begin to imagine that stealing the handkerchief and giving it to her husband is going to be a good thing, but nevertheless she does it, and she betrays Desdemona in ways which are irretrievable, and yet she comes through in this extraordinary way at the end, and she gains. There's a moment in the last scene of the play where Desdemona is expiring in the room. Excuse me, and
bless
I'm
you.
expiring myself, and her cries are picked up by Amelia outside as if her voice goes to Amelia. So I think that reimagining of sorry, very
Bless
bad
you. Yeah.
timing. That reimagining of Emilia is really interesting. You talk for a bit while I find
Yeah.
my voice.
Thank you very much for watching. Links to our other interviews should be floating all over your screen now. If you enjoyed this interview, you might enjoy those as well. Please like, please subscribe, please write a comment, preferably a very controversial comment, and click on that Patreon link and just stroke your chin and look at your screen and really think about it. Really have a good think about it.